Hey, what's up? It's me, Lex, back at you with another video. Today I'm going to be doing a tier list on all of the weapon traits in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Hopefully this will be able to help you out when picking your next weapon, or just when evaluating different weapons, what they're capable of, what kind of utility and power each of them can provide. I'm going to be ranking things based not only on their exact effects, for example, maybe Agile could be a strictly better effect than another trait, but I might rank that trait a little higher because the weapons that get that trait pay less in their power budget to acquire it. So keep that in mind when I rank things, that I'm taking into account the total power budget, not just the sheer benefits that the trait is giving you. We're going to be leading off with the Agile trait. The Agile trait, and I will be bringing these up as each one comes along, makes it so that the multiple attack penalty you take with this weapon on your second attack is -4 instead of -5, and -8 instead of -10 on the third and subsequent attacks in the turn. The largest issue with the Agile trait is that basically every single weapon that it is on pays for the Agile trait with 1 or 2 die steps. And this is another thing I'm going to be bringing up as I go through here. A die step is, for example, a D4 to a D6 to a D8, to a D10, and then to a D12 at maximum. And on average, each die step increase is going to increase your average damage by 1. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind when you're considering weapons. Although there is, of course, the swing potential, and we'll get into that when we get further down the list, of having higher dice. For example, just because improving a D10 weapon to a D12 weapon only improves your average damage from 5.5 to 6.6, it does increase your maximum damage by 2. It goes from 10 to 12 in that situation. So, while average damage isn't everything, I think it's generally speaking going to be the thing that most players are going to want to focus on. And because Agile is taking away quite a lot of average damage, and because of the fact that you shouldn't be trying to attack multiple times in a turn, unless you're something like a monk who gets that for very cheap, or a flurry ranger who gets to stack their benefit on top of Agile and get absurdly low multiple attack penalties. It's not going to be outperforming a lot of other weapons. I think that you will find much greater potency in your character and gameplay by trying to pick a weapon that provides something more on its first strike. However, because it is still a very potent ability, and specifically and especially because your hands, your unarmed attacks are agile, which allows your athletics maneuvers to be agile as well, it is going to take a seat up in A+. Very solid, but not the best. Next off, we have Backstabber. Backstabber makes it so that when you hit an off-guard creature, it deals an additional precision damage, and that increases to 2 if you have a +3 weapon, which you get at level 16. It's not the greatest. It has some support specifically in the new, I believe, crossbow crack shots on the gunslinger, where it changes that effect to instead be 2 damage per weapon damage die, but only on crossbows, which is far more potent, the 2 to 8 damage. But it is still free damage. It means that on an off-guard opponent, your weapon is essentially an entire die step higher. And I'll actually bring up the Backstabber page here. You can see down in here that weapons that have the Backstabber trait although it doesn't have the greatest assortment because a lot of them are D4 weapons. They are not paying significantly high amounts of their power budget for the Backstabber traits. And so it ends up, when it works, just being a very solid upgrade. For example, the Arbalest, even if you don't have crossbow crackshot, is a D10, or essentially, mathematically on average anyway, a D12 weapon when attacking an off-guard creature. So, Backstabber is also going to be taking its place, I'll say in the A tier. And I'll be revisiting all of these at the end of the tier list creation, just to move them around, balance them all out, put them where I think they should be equivalent to one another. We're going to get right into Backswing next. Backswing is a weapon trait that allows you to, when you miss an attack with the weapon, gain a +1 circumstance bonus to your next attack with the weapon before the end of your turn. It's not the greatest trait. It's essentially agile, but only if you miss, and only if the reason that you incremented your map was using this weapon to begin with. But it is, by the merits of being a less powerful version of Agile, able to go on some stronger weapons, for example, the Great Club here. And so in situations where you want to be able to hit with your large weapons, perhaps you're a two-handed fighter or something like that, this can be a pretty decent tool. Backswing is going to find its way, I think, pretty solidly into B tier. It's going to be, I think, defining B tier for us, where it's agile, worse, but on better weapons. Brace is our next trait here. The Brace trait is a very interesting one. When you ready to strike an opponent that moves within your reach until the start of your next turn, strikes with the Brace weapon deal an additional 2 precision damage for each weapon damage die it has. It's only on 2 weapons here, the Nodachi and the Long Hammer. As you can see, both of these weapons have the reach traits, which means that it's particularly effective at being able to hit creatures as they're coming into your reach. And they don't pay particularly high values for the Brace traits. As you can see, they're both D8 and reach. The Nodachi is advanced, so it gets a little bit more budget with the Deadly D12, but the Long Hammer, it also gets trip and versatile piercing. And 2 precision damage per weapon damage die is essentially 2 upgrades to its damage dice. So both of these, when you've readied, function on average as D12 weapons, which is very, very good. Reach D12 is an insane combination to be able to pull off. The largest issue that Brace runs into is that readying takes 2 actions. It has the concentrate trait and then uses your reaction. And it will only benefit on that. So there's a lot of possibility for a creature perhaps to not even provoke your readied action here. And because it says moves within your reach, it also means that you're not going to be able to use ready to prepare for when a creature enters your reach. So it has to be on that 5-foot square where they're approaching you from within your reach that you hit them. Overall, though, the large amount of damage that it deals and the fact that it's taking away almost nothing from the power budget is going to land it, I think, very solidly into A tier. Readying is, despite its costs, an incredibly potent tool. I recommend everyone attempt to use. If you're not used to utilizing it, I would recommend giving it a shot. Even if you play suboptimally, you'll learn and you'll be able to use it more effectively in the future. I'm going to take a drink real quick. Alrighty, we're going to get into the capacity trait next. The capacity trait is for weapons that have multiple barrels or chambers capable of containing a bolt or round of ammunition. It's accompanied by a number which indicates the amount of barrels or chambers. And then after you've fired it, you can select the next loaded barrel or chamber as an interact action that doesn't require a free hand. And then any ability that lets you interact to reload also lets you interact to switch the chambers of a capacity weapon. And you can individually reload any empty barrel with an interact action as well. The capacity trait used to be a lot more useful. With a recent errata, the Gunslinger feat, I believe, yes, feat, that allowed you to reload a weapon even when both of your hands were free. It used to be its own action, so you could not combine the ability to, as say, a pistolero, dual-wielding revolvers. You could not reload a gun using your slinger's reload. You had to use that specific reload. But it has been errata to allow any reload to just bypass the fact that you're holding two weapons. And so now the capacity trait has, at least in my eyes, kind of fallen by the wayside. The most interesting use case I can think of for capacity is still present, however, which is that you can have special ammunition loaded into the other chambers of your capacity weapon. So, for example, if we take, let's say, just how about the rotary bow? Yes. The rotary bow has capacity 4, reload 1, and some other statistics that aren't particularly relevant. It uses bolts. You could have the other 3 slots in the rotary bow be filled with magical, alchemical, or precious material ammunition. Say some climbing bolts, some cold iron in case you run into a fae, and then I don't know if there's an explosive arrow off the top of my head, but one of those. And you could utilize that 4th slot for just your standard ammunition, because it is still a normal weapon. It's just that it allows you additionally to rotate. And this would allow you to be able to switch to the special ammunition and activate it and shoot it. The largest issue there, though, is that that is only going to be helpful if your weapon is already loaded, because otherwise you would simply load in the ammunition you want to use and then use it. And the largest issue with the combination trait is ultimately just that, especially after the buff to Gunslinger, which I'm not going to say was a bad change. I think it was a good change, in fact. It just doesn't really do much of anything. The only situation that it's going to benefit you is if your gun is fully loaded, but you want to use special ammunition, and you have that special ammunition already loaded into one of your additional slots. So, and besides that, it does not pay particularly heavily in its power budget to gain the capacity traits, but it does pay a little bit. And when it's not giving you any tangible benefit, that means that capacity is going to land itself. I'm going to say, honestly, it's going to define D tier for us for now. Next up is the climbing trait. This is on a whole singular weapon, the boarding axe. The hand holding this weapon is freely available to climb. It's on the boarding axe, which is an uncommon Azarketi weapon. The ability to climb is, I think, a little underrated. I think that people could always go with trying to utilize the terrain around them. I've had some very interesting experiences in some recent games that I've run and played where the ability to climb was used with some potency. I think the largest issue here, as far as being able to rank it, is that there isn't a whole lot to draw on. There's a singular weapon. It's one-handed. It's a D6, which is less damage than a one-handed weapon can do, but that's because it's agile. As far as I can tell here, climbing is essentially a free benefit for this, and it's specifically to keep it maybe thematically in line with its use case as a boarding axe. I'm going to let it land solidly into C tier. It's not doing anything particularly exciting. What it provides is still useful, especially, say, if you're dual wielding these axes and you don't have any kind of feature that would allow you to climb using, say, like your legs, like some of the lizard folk feats. You would still be able to catch an edge if you were surprised by a trap, whereas someone else dual wielding would not. But it's also not adding a whole lot. Next, we're going to move on to, and for this one, I'm actually going to add a row at the very bottom here and name this row F tier, and I'll make it purple. There we go. Beautiful. Alrighty, this next trait is the Cobbled trait. This is on 3 weapons. No matter how well you upkeep this firearm, it is likely to misfire. Every time you fail an attack roll, the attack misses, and you must roll a DC 5 flat check. If you fail, the weapon misfires. So that's a 20% chance every single time you miss a bullet that you're going to have to spend an additional action to unjam your gun. This is on the Big Boom gun, which is a one-handed modular D6, 2 bulk, but 20-foot range gun with fatal D12. The Big Boom gun is wild. It's got a whole mix here. The Spoon gun, which is the same, but with a little more range, and it exchanges the fatal D12 for scatter 5 feet. And the Liar's gun, which is a pepper box, concussive D4, fatal D8. Alrighty. The Cobbled trait is very clearly an incredibly poor trait to have on a weapon, and I suppose it is providing a large amount to the power budget, at least it seems so with the Big Boom gun here, because a one-handed weapon doing a D6, having fatal D12, and having modular for all 3 damage types, that's a lot of fun. The Big Boom gun also has an additional downside, where if you critically fail, you take a D12 of fire damage as it explodes in your face. I think from looking at all of these, I'll admit I did not have the Cobbled trait the best prepared beforehand. It's definitely adding to the power budget by having this on it. It's definitely on some very interesting, very unique and fun weapons. But I think for the pure difficulty of consistency, I am going to have to stick with F tier, unfortunately. Maybe it'll wiggle its way up into D tier when I do the recap at the end. Next up is the combination traits. The combination trait is actually for a special type of weapon, combination weapons. They function both as melee weapons and ranged weapons, but not at the same time. It takes a interact action to switch between the 2 modes, but it allows you to make a ranged strike immediately after a successful melee strike without switching to the ranged usage. Both usages share fundamental runes, so that is going to be your potency and your striking. They do not share property runes. If the property rune would be invalid on one of them. So they give an example is Vorpal, it is only for slashing melee weapons, so it would only apply to the axe half of an axe musket. I think the biggest issue with combination weapons in the present game is just that the budget that the game assigns the players as far as gold goes is often enough to have and maintain 2 weapons. Maybe one of them will be a little bit behind, but both of those weapons will be better than a combination weapon. Because combination weapons pay for their ability here to share runes, primarily with a pretty decent amount of damage. And even after the recent errata that they received that buffed a lot of them, many of them are still quite lacking in their potency. I'm not going to say that they are bad weapons. Absolutely not. You can still use them to great effect. And in games where you are on more of a budget, or in a game where you perhaps would just prefer to use your budget on things perhaps more versatile and utility-based than maintaining 2 separate weapons, the combination trait and its weapons are going to be a very solid pick. It's going to land somewhere between A and B. I'm going to lean towards A for this initial ruling here. Being able to save money, buy some scrolls for your wizard, buy some talismans for your armor, buy any number of things that might help out your party by saving on having a second weapon is going to be useful. Even though I think that the majority of the time it's going to end up being a worse weapon than if you just had 2 different weapons. Or even if you focused a little harder on one type of weapon. For example, I think you'll get more out of being a melee warrior than you will trying to build into both the ranged and melee capabilities of a combination weapon. Next up is Concealable. This one is very simple. It gives you a +2 circumstance bonus to stealth checks and DCs to hide or conceal a weapon with this trait. It's on a few weapons. A lot of them are uncommon. A lot of them are very poor weapons, like the corset knife. One of my favorite weapons, the exquisite sword cane, has this. Generally speaking, I don't think weapons with this trait have it take much, if anything, out of their power budget. I think that it's mostly on things that make thematic sense to be items that you could easily conceal on yourself, like a sword hidden within a cane, or a knife kind of stuck into your hair, etc. But it's also not very useful in almost any campaign and many situations. It's going to land, I think, very solidly in the C tier. It's not taking anything away, so that's going to account for the fact that it's very, very niche. Next up is Concussive. Whenever a creature would have resistance or immunity to damage from a concussive weapon, you treat it as the better of piercing or bludgeoning. So this allows, for example, the arquebus rifle to not suffer any resistance when shooting at, say, a skeleton with a weakness to bludgeoning damage. It does not trigger weaknesses, notably. It only allows you to bypass resistances or immunities, but it's actually pretty remarkable how often something will have a resistance or immunity to one of these 2 types, but not the other. And the concussive trait doesn't take a whole lot, if anything, out of the weapons that it's on either, as far as power budget goes. So I think it's going to land itself, I'll say again, a very solid C tier. C for Climbing, Concealable, and Concussive. Next up is Critical Fusion. Critical Fusion is a trait on some combination weapons. It grants you additional options for your crit spec when using the combination weapon's melee attack, as long as the ranged weapon is loaded. And you can only have one crit spec effect at a time. But this allows you to choose between doing the critical specialization effect for firearms, which is that they have to make a fortitude save against your class DC or become stunned 1. Or you can discharge the range. Both of these discharge the ranged weapon to increase the critical hits momentum, dealing 2 additional damage per weapon damage die. It's a very sizable amount of damage. It means that on a critical hit, you're going to be basically increasing the size of your dice by 2. And then all of that will be getting doubled because... Oh, yes. But that's the issue, is that because it is a critical specialization effect, the 2 additional damage does not get doubled. Which means that functionally, as far as the game mechanics go, because this only happens when you're critically hitting, this is 1 additional damage per weapon damage die. And it's just becoming functionally doubled by being on a critical hit. Critical Fusion also doesn't take the largest amount away from the items that it's on, but it is a very expensive feat as far as actual actions within combat. Having to discharge the firearm, have it loaded in the first place. You're using a combination weapon, which is weaker than a weapon of its type. Overall, it's going to be getting a, I think, D tier. It still has something to offer, just like capacity does, but as far as the benefit that it's offering, it's less consistent, it's harder to achieve, and it's not particularly outstanding. Next up is going to be Deadly. Deadly is another thing that happens on a critical hit. Whenever the weapon crits, it adds an additional weapon damage die of the listed size after doubling the weapon's damage. This increases to 2 dice if you have a greater striking rune, sets level 12, and 3 dice if the weapon has a major striking rune, sets at level 19. So that would be anywhere from 1 to 3 additional dice. And if an ability changes the die size of the weapon's damage dice, it does not change the size of the deadly dice. This can be a very potent ability. Being able to just add extra damage on a critical hit feels very good when you're critically hitting regularly. And most weapons that have this aren't paying for it with particularly high amounts of their power budget either. It's a very fun trait to pull off, and I'm going to be putting it into A+ tier. It's just some extra damage whenever you crit, and it's not taking a whole lot away. Next up is the Disarm trait. This is one of many traits that I'm here from this point on going to refer to as the skill action traits. Each skill action trait shares a name with the skill action that it is aligned with. It lets you use your weapon's item bonus to benefit that action. Lets you use your weapon's reach with that action. Lets you use any hands wielding that weapon for that action. And lets you, if you critically fail that action, drop the weapon instead of suffering the critical failure effects of the skill action. And so Disarm here is for the disarm action, which specifically is not a particularly potent action. It is still a very useful one, and especially if you can get that critical success effect and pull a weapon just straight out of someone's hands, it can be very strong. I've done so in a couple of games. But as far as these skill traits are going to go, I think Disarm is going to probably be the weakest one. And because you still need a free hand to be able to grab the item that you disarm, and if you don't, the enemy will just pick it right back up again. Ultimately, it's going to be one of the least useful ones. Next up is the Double Barrel trait. The Double Barrel trait gives you 2 barrels, each is loaded separately, and you can fire both of them in a single strike to increase the weapon's damage die by 1 step. And it also increases the fatal traits die by 1 step, if it has it. This is on 2 weapons, the double-barreled pistol and the double-barreled musket. And the biggest issue with this is that these are kind of weapons that are taking a penalty to their damage for the double-barreled trait. And so, as you can see here, for example, with the double-barreled musket, it's a D6 weapon with a fatal D10 and a range of 60 feet. It's 2-handed, reload 1, the concussive trait, and all of that put together is outperformed by an arquebus, which is also 2-handed, has a longer range, deals a D8 of damage, only reload 1 as well, has fatal D12, has concussive, and does not require you to fire 2 bullets at once with the double barrel to get all of those benefits. The primary benefit of the double barrel trait that I can think of is that you can, as with the capacity trait, have special ammunition loaded in to both barrels, activate both, and then fire both of them with a single shot. And that could have some particularly potent effects if you critically hit and get all of those benefits. I would have to double check if that is rules legal, but I believe it should be. Alchemical ammunition, or I guess it's a magical ammunition is where the rules are stored under. I don't believe there's anything preventing you from having 2 of them at once, so I will skim this very briefly. Once you activate it, shoot it before the end of your turn. And okay, so yeah, that would be the primary benefit of these double-barreled weapons, would be that you could start a turn with 2 different magical or alchemical ammunitions loaded into each barrel. Well, 1 in each, so a total of 2. You activate them both with your first 2 actions, and then shoot them with a single action and potentially gain the effects of both, which is very interesting. But as far as the weapons themselves go, and as far as the action economy of loading both of them up, activating both, shooting to apply the effects of both, it is going to be a worse weapon. And in fact, it is paying exactly what it's giving you, but then has additional costs to gain what it's giving you. So I think double barrel is going to land itself in probably C tier for me. It would go into D tier if it didn't have that use case of being able to take advantage of doubling up on special ammunition types, but because it can do that, it does have some use cases. I might be convinced once I get around to the review round to bring it up to B tier for that, because there are some very powerful magical ammunitions. Next up is the Fatal Aim trait. The Fatal Aim trait allows you to hold the stock of the weapon under one arm to fire it with a single hand. as long as your other hand, so the one that is holding the stock, isn't holding a weapon, shield, or anything else you would need to move and position to ensure that the weapon doesn't slip out from under your arm. And then if you use both hands, the weapon can make fatal attacks. So it'll then gain the fatal traits with the listed damage die. Holding the weapon under arm stably enough to fire is significantly more complicated than just releasing a single hand from the weapon. So to switch between the two grips, you need to use an interact action rather than releasing or as part of reloading. The aura as part of reloading bit here is what really kills it for me, I think. Because Fatal Aim does have some benefits in that you can offhand say a scroll as a spell shot gunslinger that you might want to be able to cast any item that you don't need to move in position. But because you need to spend a dedicated singular action that you can't combine with anything else to two-hand your Fatal Aim weapon and gain the benefits of it being a strong gun, it's paying a lot in its action economy for what's ultimately a little bit of utility in a very niche situation. As far as the actual effects, or statistics, I should say, of the guns, they're pretty decent. Like, for example, the Agile, which is the go-to for a Fatal Aim gun, has Concussive, Fatal Aim D12, and it's a D8 weapon. All it's losing out on here is a little bit of range on an Arquebus. And I suppose the Kickback trait, but it's really just this. It's the fact that you can't spend a reload action to switch between the two grips as part of it, which is something you can do normally. I do want to bring this up in case anyone was unaware of this. When you use the reload action, there we go. Switching your grip to free a hand and then to place your hands in the grip necessary to wield the weapon are both included in the actions you spend to reload a weapon. So this means that if you were normally one-handing a weapon and it had the ability to be two-handed, so for example, maybe say someone's wielding an Arquebus, they release a hand off of it to battle medicine someone, their reload action could then also cause them to be two-handing the weapon again, which is a very potent amount of action compression built into the reload action. And Fatal Aim just doesn't get that benefit, and unfortunately is going to be landing itself. I'm going to say honestly in F tier for now. It's not that it's a purely bad trait in the way that Cobbled is. It's just that as far as what it's providing for you, it's very, very little. And so situationally negligible that I think it deserves to be down here alongside Cobbled giving some more power budget to a weapon, but making the weapon quite bad. Next up is the Fatal trait. Seen this referenced a couple times because a lot of these have been firearm traits. The Fatal trait includes a die size. On a critical hit, the weapon's damage die increase to that die size instead of the normal one, and the weapon adds one additional damage die of the listed size. Usually, this is quite a large upgrade. So, for example, we'll take the let's say the light pick. It's a D4 weapon that is an average damage per die of 2.5, and it has Fatal 1d8. So whenever you critically hit, that 2.5 is increasing to 4.5. Combined with the fact that it gives you an additional die that will not be doubled, so it's going to be less potent than the die increases on the damage that is getting doubled. you're going to be dealing a significantly higher amount of damage with your crits if it has the Fatal trait. Essentially, because it's increasing the actual weapon damage dice, any benefit that it's providing is double of what it would be. So the exact same thing that caused the critical fusion trait to be bad, because it added additional damage as part of the critical specialization effect, it meant that that 2 damage was not getting doubled. The Fatal trait is so good because what it does is getting doubled. When it is boosting the Arquebus's damage per die from a D8 to a D12, that would be 2 extra damage, but because it's the damage that's getting doubled, that's actually 4 damage. Anywhere from 4 to 16 once you get all of your striking runes. And that's on top of just giving you an extra die at the end of your damage that is not getting doubled. Fatal is an incredible trait. It's a very, very fun one. It basically carries the entirety of the gun class of weapons. It makes the fact that they have to spend actions reloading actually reasonable. Most classes will shy away from firearms regardless, and especially specifically with Gunslinger and even Fighter, but mainly Gunslinger, the ability to hit criticals and do immense amounts of damage, changing from your average amounts at range where you're doing very, very little to these immense values because you get such massive increases with Fatal. It's a lot of fun, it's very strong, and it's going to land Fatal as our first S-tier weapon trait. It's basically capable of making or breaking, defining an entire playstyle and an entire class of weapon. And for that, it's very, very solid. Next up is the Finesse trait. This allows you to use your Dexterity modifier instead of Strength when making attack rolls with the melee weapon. Damage is still calculated using Strength. This is on a whole bunch of weapons. I'm not going to get into them in particular. The largest issue that Finesse faces is that many weapons that have the Finesse trait, just like Agile, pay for it with damage. The Strength weapons are almost across the board going to be doing more damage in their dice, and because you're using Strength for them, are going to be doing more flat damage as well. And the flat damage that your Strength modifier provides does get less important as the game goes on, but I would say that it stays particularly relevant as high as upwards into the mid-levels, level 10, 11, 12. And so what I run into mainly is that if you're in melee and you want to use a Finesse weapon, you're probably better off just having an Agile weapon and investing into Strength, because then you will be gaining the benefits of damage from Strength and the benefits of Agile. And Finesse ends up more or less being a trait used to kind of provide a stepping stone for people who are primarily ranged to have a backup melee option, so that they do not get hit by things like Attack of Opportunity. There are obvious standouts like on the Swashbuckler, Rogue, and Investigator, where Finesse or Agile as a trait can enable some of their tools. And I do think that I'm going to place it very solidly into B tier despite all of my criticisms of it, because it is still allowing people to do things that they otherwise would not be able to do, which is making dexterity combatants. But I think that ultimately Strength is going to be the go-to skill for melee combat, and Finesse is not competing in that field. It's trying to increase the variety of things that people can do as ranged classes, not provide dexterity melee a way to become relevant. Next up is the Forceful trait. This one makes it so that whenever you attack with the weapon more than once, the second attack gains a bonus to damage equal to the number of weapon damage dice, and every attack after the second gains a circumstance bonus to damage equal to double the number of damage dice. This is a very significant amount of damage, and because it's applying not on a critical hit, just a flat boost to your damage, this can be very potent. As potent specifically as you see here, if you manage a critical hit on your maximum multiple attack penalty attacks, it's going to have just about the same influence on your damage as the fatal trait will. The biggest issue is that it's hard to hit enemies when you're suffering your multiple attack penalty. This can be carried by things like Flurry Ranger. Flurry Ranger is going to get a lot of benefit out of the Forceful trait, but as far as most other weapons go, I feel confident saying that this might as well be a, not exactly a throwaway trait, but definitely a Hail Mary trait. You're going to swing and really hope you roll a 19 or a 20. But if you do, it's going to do some great things for you. It doesn't even take much away from the power budget, though it definitely does take away a measurable amount. For example, here on the falchion, it's a two-handed 1d10 weapon with Forceful and Sweep. And the Great Axe, I believe, is a d12 two-handed weapon with just Sweep. So Forceful is generally going to be taking away a step of dice from your damage. And the fact that it's a circumstance bonus also means that there are some very niche situations where the Forceful trait is going to be overwriting or not stacking with perhaps more clearly some benefits that you or your teammates might be able to provide. But it's still generally a good trait for those who can use it, especially things like monks. Although I do not believe there are any monk-traded weapons with Forceful. I could be wrong with that. I suppose there's ancestral weaponry, which allows monks to use some of these weapons that have ancestral traits for flurry of blows. And in that case, it could be quite good for them as well. Although definitely still less so than the Flurry Ranger. Flurry Ranger is going to carry Forceful. I still think that it is a very solid trait. And I'm going to land it up into... it's got to be between B or C tier. And I think it's going to land in C tier for now. The amount of damage that it can provide is quite a high amount. But the consistency with which it will provide it to you is not great, and it can encourage bad play patterns, especially if you're not particularly aware of the drawbacks of the multiple attack penalty. Things like that. I'm going to take a real quick drink for my throat. Alrighty. Now let's get into the freehand trait. The freehand trait is on a few select weapons. It is a weapon that cannot be disarmed, and as long as the hand is otherwise unoccupied, you can use the weapon within it, and you can use it to wield other items and perform any actions you could with a free hand. Essentially, this is something you put over your free hand, like a gauntlet here, and you still have the hand, but as long as that hand is free, you are wielding the free-handed weapon and can use it. This is particularly effective with things like the gauntlet bow, allowing you to have a weapon available to you as long as you have a free hand. The biggest issue is that basically everything with the free hand trait is very weak, which is reasonable. If they were any stronger, they would be taking away from the niche that the monk or any other unarmed attack, unarmed fighters gain access to and benefit from. And so you're mainly going to be holding on to these for the benefits that they can provide otherwise. And the Gauntlet Bow is the biggest example of that, because I believe if I go to Path Builder here, I want to fact check myself before I make a claim. The Gunslinger gains access to the Fake Out trait, yes, which can be activated with a crossbow. And so if you have a Gauntlet Bow on one of your hands and you just release that hand off of your gun at the end of your turn, you can always use Fake Out using the Gauntlet Bow without having to reload your gun. And then, as I covered before, using the reload action will re-two-hand your gun and you can continue to use it as normal. The freehand trait is mostly for versatility, not for power. And the things that it is on are already kind of limited by the concept of being freehand. So I think it's going to land itself up in B tier. Very solid. The weapons that it's on are not peak weapons, but they are perhaps peak tools. Grapple is our next skill trait, and as I said when we did the Disarm one, I'm not going to be redefining what that means, but Grapple is going to be going into S tier. The ability to potentially grapple people at a range and be able to hold them at a distance where they cannot retaliate against you is incredibly strong. There are rules covering the fact in the GM core book that if a creature is grappling you with an appendage, so if, for example, someone cast Enlarge on me and I grappled the monster that we're fighting, they should then be able to strike me because I'm using my hand to grab them, and they can attack at that. But there is no such assurance with the grapple traits. If you are using I believe Bill Hook is the go-to weapon. Let me bring it up. Yes, the Gill Hook, which is a reach weapon with the grapple trait. It does a d10 of damage, and the Azarketi trait, so you can, even though it's uncommon, gain access to it as a human or as an Azarketi with some feats. This would allow you to essentially grapple anything that does not have a reach attack and render them incapable of fighting back until they have escaped and close the distance on you. It's an incredibly strong ability to be able to pull out, and being able to drop the weapon to avoid the effects of a critical failure attempt to grapple is just icing on the cake. Grapple is incredibly potent, and I would recommend honestly not doing this to your GM unless they specifically want to combine some kind of game together with you and the rest of the players for kind of a power gaming style crawl or campaign, because it can very, very quickly turn into the GM essentially being forced to use creatures that have reach attacks, or else they will not be able to do anything. Alrighty. Next up is the Hampering trait. The Hampering weapon, when you hit with it, you can use an interact action on your next action to give the target a minus 10-foot circumstance penalty to all of their speeds. The penalty will end after they take a move action at the start of your next turn if you attack with the weapon again, or if you move out of reach of the target, whichever comes first. It's on two weapons, the Whipclaw and the Donchak. It's not a particularly helpful trait. A speed penalty based off of a specific action, and especially an action that would provoke a reactive strike if the creature does have that, is not the greatest, especially because a lot of enemies that get into melee with you are going to want to stay in melee with you, and so giving them a speed penalty will not be particularly effective. Otherwise, a lot of them are going to step away from you before they stride, which then means that because it ends after they take a move action, that they can then stride unimpeded. A lot of creatures will do this to attempt to avoid a potential reactive strike, because if you get up in their face with a weapon and you look like a trained fighter, a lot of creatures will assume that you have reactive strike if they're not mindless. Overall, it just suffers from the fact that it's a decent effect, but it's far too situational and far too easy to disrupt with this whole list of things. If it lasted until, say, the end of the creature's turn, as long as you didn't move or strike again with the weapon, something like that, that would perhaps be more useful. On the bright side, it doesn't pay a whole lot for the ability to do this. As you can see here, the Whip Claw is a D6 reach finesse weapon, so it's already struggling in a few places with keeping up with its damage. And then right here we have a reload tethered thrown reach weapon on a with a D8. Overall, I think Hampering is going to land in the D tier. It doesn't add enough to a weapon to stand on its own or be worth the even minor trade-offs that it takes away. Next up is the injection trait. The injection trait allows you to fill the weapon with a liquid, usually an injury poison, and then after a successful attack with the weapon, you can inject the target with the loaded contents with a single interact action. And then you can refill the weapon with a new substance, taking 3 interact actions and 2 hands. The biggest issue here is that you can already simply coat a weapon with an injury poison. While this can give you a second usage of injury poisons without having to reapply it, poisons are also already a generally very weak option, and you'll probably only be using them if you have something like the Poisoner dedication, or if you are a toxicologist alchemist. And for either of those classes, this is just not a very helpful thing towards the goal of poisoning enemies, and the weapons that it's on are weak, particularly. So, for example, here, the Umbrella Injector, it's Concealable, Finesse, Parry, and Injection, and it does a D4 of damage. The Injection Spear is perhaps the best one. It's Reach, a D8 of piercing damage with the Injection trait, but you could get a D10 of damage and an additional trait alongside Reach if you got rid of Injection. And ultimately, I think it just suffers from the fact that what it's trying to do is already a kind of poor choice for a character. It can definitely do some interesting things. Just being able to have an injury poison ready to go without needing to repoison can be helpful, but especially because it requires an interact action that can provoke reactive strikes, I think it's going to fall into the F tier. Next up is the Jousting trait. Jousting is a very interesting trait. While you are mounted, if you moved at least 10 feet on the action before your attack, add a circumstance bonus to damage for that attack equal to the number of damage dice for the weapon. So, 1 per damage die. In addition, while mounted, you can wield the weapon in one hand, but that changes the damage die to the listed value, which, as you can see in both cases on the Lance and the War Lance, is lower damage. As part of your action to mount a creature, you can switch your grip on a jousting weapon to one-handed. After that, changing your grip takes the same actions as normal. If you dismount while wielding a jousted weapon one-handed, you can switch to using 2 hands as part of that action if you have a hand free. If not, you'll still be holding the weapon in one hand, but not wielding it. So, ultimately, the issue that jousting runs into is that it's not providing a whole lot of benefit for the one-handed bit. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that generally speaking, you would be better off wielding a different one-handed weapon while mounted, if that is what you are intending to do. If you want a shield and a weapon, you're better off with, say, as simple a thing as a long sword. But the benefit to damage, regardless of how you're wielding it, if you move 10 feet on the action before your attack, so you command an animal, your mount moves and you deal damage, or it's a mature animal and it gets to move on its own. This is kind of just adding a free additional damage to your strikes, benefiting on top of the fact that your animal companion is moving you for free by being a mounted creature. As we can see, though, unfortunately, the lances kind of pay in damage. It's a little complicated because the D8 and reach for a two-handed weapon is definitely a little lower than the standard you would expect. You would expect a D10 for a two-handed reach weapon. But the deadly D8 means that it can do a lot more on a successful critical hit. And so ultimately it's going to be landing, I think, very solidly into the B tier. It's free damage, bringing you up and essentially paying off the downside that your weapons, the jousting weapons, are taking for being deadly weapons. And it's, again, basically free. I don't recommend engaging with the one-handed mechanic of jousting, however, which makes it a little less interesting, but still good. Next up is the Kickback trait. Kickback is another firearm trait that makes it so that you need to meet a strength requirement to utilize the weapon, specifically strength 14. Otherwise, you will suffer a -2 circumstance penalty to your attack rolls, but as long as you meet that penalty, or I suppose I should say, regardless of whether you meet the strength requirement or not, it gives you 1 additional damage with all of its attacks. And you can use bipod, tripod stabilizers to lower or negate the penalty. And I believe there is another item that allows you to increase the strength requirement, but also it will give you additional damage. Overall, the Kickback trait is not a heavy trait in my mind when I'm thinking about weapons. Generally speaking, it's going to be a decent trait. I mean, it's a flat damage. That's basically increasing the damage dice of the weapon by 1. Like, for example, the Arquebus here, when it's at a single die, the D8 is closer to a D10, but then every future D8 is simply another D8. So it's definitely not as strong as getting a damage per weapon damage dice. It's not particularly impactful. It's more of a requirement, really, in build crafting, where it requires you to give something up to match that strength requirement, or give up actions, items, and etc. to match the strength requirement after it has been lowered with items. Kickback, I think, is generally going to fall into C tier. It's solid enough, it gives a benefit, and it's easy to build around. It's not really taking too much away from you. Next up is the Modular trait. Modular is followed by listed damage types, and you can use an interact action while wielding the weapon to switch between the listed damage types, and it will deal that damage type until you switch to a different one. You can see this on things like the Big Boom Gun, the Hand Cannon, which has a d6 of damage, the Poly Tool, which is agile and modular, things like the Switch Scythe. The biggest issue with modular is that while it's providing a lot of versatility in the different physical damage types you can choose from, very often, though not all of the time, I will admit, you will find that the physical damage types as a whole are what is resisted. It's not that something is resistant to bludgeoning and slashing but weak to piercing. It's that it is resistant to all physical damage except if it's cold iron, something like that. There are still plenty of creatures that do have this trade-off, though, where modular can be useful. Things like, I believe, Some types of tree have slashing weaknesses. Skeletons have bludgeoning weaknesses. I believe things like the... I can't remember. But the big glob of flesh aberration that's like talking constantly, I believe it has resistance to bludgeoning. Things like this. Modular can be very helpful. I'm not going to write it off entirely, but I do think that generally a lot of the weapons seem to pay a damage die for the ability to be modular, and it's not quite strong enough in that and having to also spend an action switching the damage type. So modular is going to land itself in C tier. It does still have something to offer, but it's not quite good. Next up is the non-lethal trait, which I'll bring up right here. Attacks with the weapon are non-lethal and knock creatures unconscious instead of killing them. And you can take a -2 circumstance penalty to make a lethal attack with a non-lethal weapon. Generally speaking, this is going to be a downside. There are a fair amount of creatures that are entirely immune to non-lethal damage. And generally speaking, there's very little reason outside of scenarios where you can prepare for the occasion that you want to avoid killing something. This can be useful for roleplay. This can be useful for very niche scenarios, although in those cases I think that taking a different weapon and applying, say, a mercy rune to it would perhaps be more effective. Non-lethal is going to, I'd say, still land itself in D tier, specifically for the fact that it is a good trait to exist. It is not a good trait to have on a weapon. Next up is the Parry trait. The Parry trait, as long as you are wielding it and you are proficient with it, you can spend a single action to position it defensively, gaining a +1 circumstance bonus to AC until the start of your next turn. Essentially, it's a buckler and a weapon. And there are a lot of feats in, I believe, things like Swashbuckler that allow you to gain additional benefits from the Parry trait. Things like Twin Parry, where you can get the benefit of a whole shield from the Parry trait. Things like even the Vanguard Gunslinger class, etc. And if we look at the weapons here, things like the bow staff's melee form, which does a d6 with finesse and sweep. The bow staff, which has a d8 reach trip. Things like the exquisite sword cane, which does a d6 with agile, concealable, finesse, parry, and twins with its sheath. Things don't pay a whole lot to gain the parry trait. It's usually alongside other things. And as such, it's pretty decent. I'm going to land it, I'd say, in B tier. It more or less as a free buckler. It's a good way to spend your third action if you don't have anything else prepared, which you're not always going to be able to utilize it for something optimal. Next up is the Propulsive trait. This is a trait for ranged weapons that allows you to add half of your strength modifier to damage rolls. And if you have a negative strength modifier, you add the full strength modifier instead. This is on a very interesting assortment of items, specifically the composite short and long bows, which are essentially just direct upgrades to their normal forms, but more expensive. It's a very interesting trait. It runs into the same thing that I think Finesse runs into, but from the other direction, where if you want to be able to engage in melee combat at all, strength is probably your best bet. And so Finesse is not particularly helpful, but if you are going to be a ranged warrior and maintain the ability to engage in melee combat regardless, the Propulsive trait is a very good thing to have on your weapon. Being able to add half your strength modifier to your ranged attacks does mean that you're going to get a few extra points of damage. It's not going to be swinging the battlefield in the same way that many other traits, or particularly full-built characters are going to be, but it'll add up. And so, because it also doesn't really take anything away from the weapons that it's on, even the sling here, it's a D6 with a 50-foot range increment as a simple weapon, and it gains the propulsive trait. I think propulsive is going to take a very solid place in... It's between A and B, and I think I'm going to go for... let's say A tier. Yeah. It's going to be giving you some free damage. Next up is the Ranged Trip trait. This one I'm going to be bringing over, even though it is kind of an athletics trait. It allows you to trip within the weapon's first range increment, although you take a -2 circumstance penalty to the check when you attempt to do so. This is very potent. Being able to trip at range is essentially like a slightly weaker version of being able to grapple at reach distance with a weapon. The biggest issue that you'll run into with range trip is that the weapon is obviously leaving your hand as you throw it, and so you will either need to have many of them or recover them somehow, but that is not too difficult to do. And the ability to use maneuvers at range is just incredibly potent, and particularly because you, even if you critically fail the check, are not going to suffer any penalties because you're not holding the weapon. It's going to make its way into A tier as well. Particularly weapons with the ranged trip trait. I would recommend treating them perhaps more as tools. As you can see here, the bola, non-lethal, a d6 of damage. They're martial weapons, 20-foot range. Not particularly strong as a weapon, but very strong as a tool. And that's what I recommend treating these as. Next up is the Razing trait. This is a very interesting one. Razing weapons are particularly good at damaging objects. So whenever you deal damage to an object, including shields and animated objects, structures, or vehicles, they take additional damage equal to double the number of weapon damage dice. So interestingly, this isn't increasing the damage you do. This is increasing the amount of damage they take, which means that it doesn't get doubled on a critical hit. And for some strange reason, a lot of these weapons seem to be paying a little bit in their budget for this trait. Not an immense amount or anything, but what I've found is that this is, generally speaking, going to be too niche to be useful, and because of its odd wording, it's weaker in its niche than it feels like it should be for being so niche. It's still not bad. It will be free damage against shields, animated objects, vehicles, whatever. But it's very uncommon, I find, that you will be using a weapon and wishing that it had the Razing trait. Or using a Razing weapon and not wishing that you had chosen something a little stronger in a different area. It's still going to land itself in a solid C tier, just because it's not taking too much away. But it's very interesting. Next up is the Reach trait. This weapon can attack enemies up to 10 feet away instead of only adjacent enemies, and if you already have reach, then the weapon increases your reach by 5 feet. This is on a whole lot of weapons. Generally speaking, this is on two-handed weapons as well, and if it's on a one-handed weapon, it generally is going to pay for that with a decent amount of power. With one of the stronger examples being like the Gnome Flick Mace, which has a d6 with a reach one-handed. The reach trait is very good. Being able to attack things from outside of the quote-unquote default reach and being able to reactive strike enemies as they close the distance on you is incredibly potent as an enabling ability. And particularly if you do have things like reactive strike, or as we talked about before, the brace trait, reach can add a lot of benefit. But as far as what it is doing, it is mostly an enabler and not the strict power booster. Because often you will find that enemies are going to be engaged within their reach of your party most of the time. And so for that reason, and that reason alone, reach is settling into A+, just slightly below S tier. It could crawl up there if, say, your entire party was built for taking advantage of reach, and at that point you were forcing enemies to spend actions every turn closing the distance on you, stepping through your reach. And this isn't to say that they're not incredibly strong. It's just that they're usually strong because of surrounding circumstances and not the trait itself. They pay for the trait, usually with an entire step of damage, which is honestly a very fair trade-off. They're very reasonable weapons. And if you take issue with this being placed in A+, I want you to know I'm almost there with you. I think that it is equally valid in S. I think that it's definitely between these two, and it's a very hard race. I just err a little bit towards A+, viewing reach as more of an enabler than the actual broken component of some of the things that make it so strong. Next up is the recovery trait, but real quick, I'm going to take a drink for my throat. Alrighty. The recovery trait is a trait on thrown weapons that makes it so that when you miss, it comes back to you after the strike is complete. It's not great. It's on the boomerang and the chakri. Both of these are fine as far as weapons go. The biggest issue is that because the weapon only comes back to you if you miss, you are still going to want some ability that allows you to recall the weapons to yourself if you are attempting to use them. So, for example, a thrower's bandolier or a returning rune. The recovery trait is not going to be enabling you to play in a way that you otherwise would not be. It would instead be if you were relying on the thrower's bandolier, it could be a slight benefit in that you throw your boomerang, and if it misses, it comes back to you, and you don't need to use your next boomerang on your next attack, and you get to repeat that until you've used all of your boomerangs. But generally speaking, this is just not going to be a helpful trait. It's also not really taking anything out of the weapons that it's on, but it's going to be landing itself in D tier for being basically pointless in any build that would want to use the weapons that it's on. Next up is the recovery trait. Recovery weapons are repeating. Sorry. There we go. Repeating. Alright, the repeating trait is for weapons that basically automatically reload themselves up to a certain amount. This is for guns, all the reload weapons. For example, we have the repeating crossbow here. Or the long air repeater. And you have to kind of dig into their descriptions to understand how they function. For example, long air repeater has a magazine of 8 pellets, which means you can shoot it 8 times before you then need to reload. And reloading a magazine takes a free hand and 3 interact actions. They don't need to be consecutive. The biggest issue with the repeating trait is that the weapons it's on tend to pay for it quite immensely. The long air repeater, the air repeater, the repeating crossbow, the repeating hand crossbow, the repeating heavy crossbow, these are all paying immense amounts of their budget and their potency to gain the repeating trait. And it can be very helpful. I will say the most potent use for something like the repeating trait is when you can add immense amounts of damage onto your attacks and you need those actions for something else. Thaumaturge is my go-to example. So, for example, a Thaumaturge with an air repeater in one hand gets to make up for the fact that it's only dealing a d4 of piercing damage, with the fact that they are going to be dealing 2 plus half their level as weakness damage, and another 2 per damage die off of their implement's empowerment, increasing that 1d4 to 1d4 plus a substantial amount, probably more than the d4s could accomplish of flat damage. But generally speaking, for most people, the repeating trait and the weapons it's on is just too expensive. It's not going to benefit you. And so it is going to land itself in D tier. Despite having a use case, being useful, very nichely, generally speaking, it's not going to be worth it. The next trait is Resonant. Resonant gives you the conduct energy free action while you're wielding it. If your last action had one of a few types of energy trait on it, then you channel energy into the weapon and it deals an additional damage per weapon damage die until the start of your next turn, with a type matching the trait of the triggering action. The biggest issue you're going to run into with this one is that it is very, very unlikely that your actions that will trigger this will be less than 2 actions. These are generally going to be spells, which means you need to be casting spells already in melee range to take advantage of it. And even then, the weapons pay for the Resonant trait with a step of damage. So the Wishblade here does a d6, and when you two-hand it, it is a d10, as opposed to the Bastard Sword, which is a d8 and does a d12 when two-handed. So the main benefit here would be that if, say, the creature was weak to the damage type, then conducting energy and using it would provoke that weakness again. It definitely has a use case, but because for the majority of time, it's simply going to be giving you back what it's taking away in its own power budget, it's going to be finding its way into C tier. Next up is the Scatter trait. The Scatter trait is followed by a listed area, and on a hit, the primary target and all creatures within the scatter radius take the listed damage, or take the 1 point of splash damage per weapon damage die. It's essentially giving your firearms splash. This is how they chose to implement shotguns into Pathfinder. And so you can see here with the blunderbuss, it's a d8. And when you hit a creature, the primary target and all other creatures within 10 feet of them will take 1 to 4 splash damage. It's not particularly strong. Getting the ability to hit area damage with a weapon can very nichely be good with things like swarms that have those area weaknesses, but just equally you're going to be hitting your teammates quite often. I have a homebrew for this that I prefer that allows it to kind of like, if you get up close, do more damage, as if the bullets from the shotgun have not spread out enough. But as far as it is within the game, while it is providing a little bit of damage, a very reasonable amount, as you can see with the blunderbuss, the 1 to 4 extra damage scaling means that this is essentially a d10 weapon. It's not quite enough for the downsides that it has with hitting your teammates. And it's gonna land itself in B tier for still a decent trait, but not something that you're going to really want to aim for. And I think the biggest issue is that it's not going to match the fantasy of wielding a shotgun. Next up is the shove trait. This is another one of those skill traits for the shove action. Shoving is a little bit underrated. I think it's pretty decent. It's not always as useful as it could be, but the ability to potentially break grapples, push foes into hazardous terrain, etc. is going to land the shove traits, let's say anywhere from A to B. I'll put it in B for now. Sweep is our next trait. Sweep weapons gain a +1 circumstance bonus to their attack roll if they already attempted to attack a different target this turn using the weapon. There are some specific actions that can take advantage of this. I believe it might just be called sweep also, but there is a feat on some martial classes that allows you to roll a single attack and apply it to 2 adjacent foes, and it'll apply the sweep the sweep trait's benefit to it. Sweep is decent. It's essentially backswing or agile, but for attacking another foe instead of having missed the foe and attempting to attack them again. And it takes very, very little out of the items that it's on. For example, here the battle axe is a one-handed D8 weapon that has the sweep trait. It's going to land itself in a very solid B tier. Next up is the tethered trait. Tethered is a weapon that is attached to your hand. And as long as you have a free hand, including if you've just thrown the tethered weapon and have a hand holding nothing but the tether, you can use an interact action to pull the weapon back into your grasp after you've thrown it or it's been disarmed, unless it's being held by another creature. I talked about this the other day in my Swashbuckler preview with the combat grapple. This is a very potent trait. A very fun one as well. It allows you to take advantage of the thrown trait on your primary weapon without being worried about having to have a method to reclaim it or losing it permanently or just essentially disarming yourself, because you're able to immediately pull it back to yourself. And thrown weapons are quite good for their ability to add your strength to your damage at range, even though they still use your dexterity to hit. And generally speaking, the tethered trait also doesn't seem to pull too much from the weapon's power budget. That's more so the fact that they are thrown weapons. So generally, I'm going to say tethered will land itself in another B tier. Another very solid B tier. Alrighty. And now we are into the thrown trait. These are melee weapons that can be thrown as ranged attacks. And there we go. You add your strength mod to damage, and you use your dexterity to attack, and they have a range increment. This is on a lot of different items. But generally speaking, they're going to be taking away a little bit of damage or a little bit of versatility for the ability that you can throw them and add your full strength to damage. It's a little difficult to capitalize on the thrown trait because you need to maximize both your dexterity and your strength to kind of fully take advantage of the item, getting the damage and the to-hit chance. And as mentioned before, the fact that you might lose the weapon that you throw can also be an issue, though there are ways to combat that. But I would say that generally speaking, thrown is a very solid trait. It has a lot of support in things like the returning rune as well. And being able to not only do melee damage at range, but have the versatility to do either hitting in melee or hitting at range is strong enough to warrant putting the thrown trait up into the A tier. Next up is the training traits. This is a very niche one from Treasure Vault. Whenever you strike a creature with a training weapon, it gives your animal companion or bonded animal a +1 circumstance bonus to its next attack roll against the target. As I went into in my Ranger video, I don't think the main benefit of animal companions is their offensive capabilities. It is more so the fact that they are another body on the front lines for utility, versatility, and hit points. And there's only this single weapon to look at. It's a tethered thrown training weapon with Finesse, which is still very useful. Having both thrown and Finesse on a weapon is one of the better combos you can get, because then you can use the Finesse, maximize your dexterity, and have strength as your secondary. It's one of the few circumstances where I think Finesse really shines, is when it allows you to get the benefit of multiple traits, that being thrown and Finesse, at once. This is decent. It's very niche, and it doesn't seem to take much, if anything, away from the power budget. But because it's not adding on to something that really wants to be boosted, because it's not the best way to utilize it, I think it's going to land solidly in C tier. Next up is Trip. This is another skill trait. This is for the tripping action. Being able to trip within your reach and being able to drop the weapon is going to land it, I would say, in your choice of A+ or A tier. I'm going to say A tier. Yeah. Because being able to trip an enemy combos very well with a lot of things. It gives the enemy off guard to your ranged allies. You can grapple them while they are down to keep them from getting back up, etc. You can use reactive strike on enemies as they stand up, even though they will stand before your reactive strike goes off. It's still a very potent trait to be able to take advantage of. And being able to avoid the critical failure penalty on Trip is also very helpful. Next up is the Twin trait. This is a painful one for me to cover. Bring this over here. When you attack with a twin weapon, you add a circumstance bonus to the damage roll equal to the weapon's number of damage dice if you have previously attacked with a different weapon of the same type this turn. They need to be the same type, but they don't need to be have the same runes. The biggest issue with the twin trait is that it's adding a single damage per die, and it, across the board, costs a point of damage from the damage die. Many of these are D4s, and a lot of these are D6s. Not a single weapon here gets above a D6, even on something like the Dunpada here. Agile with a D6. Between Agile and Twin, if you attack twice, your second attack roll will be functioning as if it were, on average, a D8 attack. And that's just not particularly potent when you could instead be wielding a one-handed D8 weapon and then have an offhand Agile D6 weapon. There's no benefit there. And in fact, it's weaker because the fact that it only gives you the bonus if you've already attacked on this turn means that it has to be a multiple attack penalty attack. Means that twin weapons are, unless they have something else going for them, basically entirely going to be worse than just utilizing multiple other weapons. It's very unfortunate. I will point out that with the Dunpada here, you could wield a D8 sword in your main hand, and because it would be the same type, the Dunpada would then also essentially be a D8 with Agile. But then it's paying for that by being uncommon. It's not a useless trait. I think that generally speaking, though, it's going to struggle to be appealing as a weapon that you want to use as anything other than an offhand weapon. Which has its merits, but I think it's going to land very solidly, either C or B. I'll give it a good placing. I'll put it up into B tier. Next up is the two-hand trait. This allows you to wield the weapon with two hands, which changes its weapon damage die to the indicated value. And that applies to all of the weapon's damage dice. This is, generally speaking, going to be worse than using a D12 weapon. Or, sorry, not a D12 weapon, a two-handed weapon, if what you're going for is the two-handed ability. But as far as being a backup trait on something, if you are, say, a shield wielder, a bastard sword is a very good other weapon to be wielding, because then you have a D12 as soon as your shield is broken if you switch to it. Two-hand weapons tend not to pay much of anything for it, and it tends to simply be 2 die step upgrades for two-handing it. It's going to find its way into, I'll say A tier. Versatile is up next. Whenever you deal damage, whenever you attack, you can select a damage type listed in the versatile, and it'll deal that damage. So it's modular, but you don't need to spend actions switching between it. You just get to choose what it does. And ultimately, this is also part of why I ranked the modular weapons a little lower, is that versatile existing means that unless you're getting a benefit from having all 3 damage types from the different modular things, because versatile tends to be just the main damage type and then a second damage type. Unless you're getting benefit specifically from having all 3, versatile is just going to be a better bet for you. They have about the same cost in the weapon budget, but versatile does what it does much better. As such, it is going to go a single rank above modular, up into B tier. Next up is Volley. This is an interesting one to talk about, because just like Cobbled, this is a purely negative trait. The ranged weapon is less effective at close distances. If they're within the listed range, you take a -2 penalty to your attack roll. Why I'm including this in the list of traits to discuss is because in exchange for having the Volley trait, these weapons gain additional potency. So for example, the longbow, it is doing an additional step up in its damage dice. It does a D8 over the short bow, but it gets Volley of 30 feet, which applies a penalty to your attacks. Generally speaking, Volley is going to open up a fair amount of power, and it's a generally pretty easy thing to work around. You'll have issues in more enclosed spaces, but even within enclosed spaces, a lot of maps will accommodate for maintaining Volley range. For example, I'm running through Abomination Vaults with some of my players right now, and I have a gunslinger with a Volley weapon, and that player is facing no difficulties most of the time in achieving non-volley attacks. It can definitely be a penalty, but I think that generally the benefits of the additional power budget it opens up are going to outrank the penalty that it will apply. I think it's going to fall solidly into, let's say, B tier. And then I have a few honorable mentions. These are weapon traits that aren't exactly applicable to whether or not you want to choose a weapon, but I wanted to talk about from the weapons trait page. Alchemical items in general are very interesting because they're going to be providing magical-like effects, but without being magic, which can be very helpful for being able to carry out wondrous activities within areas where magic is highly regulated or difficult to carry out. Alchemical items are going to get overall, just as a concept, not the items in particular, a B tier. The attached trait is a trait for various weapons which you attach to others, and then you gain the weapon while you're wielding, you gain the attached weapon while you're wielding the weapon that it is attached to. So for example, there is a stock you can put on an arquebus, and then you're able to both make melee strikes with the stock and make strikes with the gun at the same time. Basically every attached weapon is good, and as such it's going to find a way into A+ tier. Clockwork is a very interesting trait. Generally speaking, it's like alchemical items, except there are less of them, and many of them are worse, but it's providing wondrous effects without the aid of magic. That's going to find its way into C tier. The monk trait is for weapons that are inherently going to be compatible with the weapons, what's it called? The monk weaponry feat that allows you to use weapons for your flurry of blows rather than only unarmed attacks. This doesn't do anything on its own, but the weapons that it's on, being available to attack twice per turn with a monk, are very interesting, and putting them onto ranged weapons is also very fun. It's also going to find its way, I'd say, into B tier. Range, just as a concept, I want to go over this one a little bit. A lot of people will have issues with ranged weapons in Pathfinder because not adding your strength modifier to damage and not being able to benefit from something like flanking often means that it will have a worse game feel in the moment. You're going to be less likely to hit, you're going to do less damage, whatever. But the benefits of range, being able to strike from far enough away that an enemy either can't get to you, has to spend multiple actions getting to you, or that you can take advantage of actions other classes or players could not, like sneaking, hiding, etc., is very, very potent. And that's going to land the concept of range up into the, I'm going to say A+ tier. And then reload as a trait is going to be very interesting because a lot of weapons that have reload also benefit from fatal. That's kind of how guns as a whole are balanced, is that crossbows are the easiest to use, but they have both low damage and reload. Bows are easier to use, but they also have kind of low damage, but no reload. And then guns are a little harder to use also, but they have reload and higher damage because of the fatal trait. Reload kind of opens up a whole balancing lever in making ranged weapons more potent than they could otherwise be, and I find it very interesting. It's going to put reload into the A tier here for how much power budget adding reload to a weapon gives to what it is possible and capable of doing. Alrighty, so that's everything onto the list here. I'm going to go down the list and see if there's anything I want to shift. In S tier, I have Fatal and Grapple. Fatal allowing you to do absolutely immense amounts of damage on critical hits, with its own potency being kind of hidden by the fact that what it's doing is also doubled by the critical hit. Grapple just allowing you to use one of the strongest skill actions in the entire game in one of the most potent ways you can in the game. I think those two are good to stay there. At A+ tier, I have Agile, because while it is a quite potent ability on its own, multiple attack penalty is kind of something you want to avoid doing anyway. Deadly, because it is a, generally speaking, worse version of Fatal. It's going to be adding more damage in strict dice, but less damage overall, because the damage from Fatal is getting doubled, the damage from Deadly is not. Reach, which is kind of an enabler for a lot of abilities or other weapon traits, and very strong in its own right, but not quite S tier in the way that Fatal and Grapple are. Trip, because it has the same potent abilities as Grapple does, where you can kind of lock down enemies and punish them, but it's just a little weaker. Attached, because it's essentially free potency onto a weapon you already have. I think I'm actually going to move Attached up to S tier, because even if the weapon is bad being able to get a free weapon is very good. Range, as an idea, I think is also going to sit very good in A tier, or A plus tier. Down to A tier, we have Backstabber, because it can provide some pretty consistent damage, and it combos very well with crossbow crackshot. Brace, very good with readying. If you have the ability to make multiple reactions a turn, you can get even more benefit out of it, but it just encourages some very interesting, fun, and potent play styles. Combination can save you some money, and can thus open up avenues for other utility. Propulsive, letting you add your strength to ranged attacks, is just a little more consistency and combos very well with the type of player and type of build that is going to want what it's offering. Ranged trip is going to be kind of freeing up your ability to trip enemies. It's a little worse than the actual trip trait because of the -2 penalty, but it essentially turns an entire category of weapons that have it into utility items. Thrown, very potent. The ability to do melee strikes at range, essentially, is quite good, especially when combined with Finesse. Two-hand, it's just free damage for multi-handing the weapon, increases the utility that it provides. And Reload, being just an immense amount of power baked into one mechanic, giving you a lot of benefits for having a weapon that you need to reload. I think all of those are good to stay in A tier. At B tier, we have Backswing for basically Agile on a creature when you've already missed. I think I'm actually going to be bumping that one down to C tier. Finesse for allowing you to kind of utilize your melee combat on a ranged character. I think I'll move that one up to A tier. Freehand for its utility in being able to provide just something there, even if none of them are particularly strong. Jousting, specifically because it's just free damage on the classes, or, well, builds that it's fitting on. Parry is a buckler as a weapon. Scatter doesn't quite do something enough for the fantasy, but is fine enough as a mechanic. And strong enough. Shove, because shove is still decent, if not the strongest of the athletics maneuvers. Sweep for its benefits to attacking multiple parties, and not requiring you to miss, unlike Backswing, before it gives you that benefit. Tethered, for its ability to use ranged, well, specifically thrown weapons as more of a backup rather than a go-to build. I think that's fine. Twin for being decent offhand weapons. In fact, perhaps very potent, but generally kind of hard to fit into a build. Versatile for being a better version of Modular, being able to hit things. Volley for adding power budget to weapons with a generally pretty easy to play around, and perhaps even playstyle incentivizing downside. And then Alchemical and Monk for just generally being interesting utility pieces. I think that works fine for B tier. At C tier, we have Climbing, so you can climb with the weapon. That's fine there. Concealable, being able to hide things a little better. Concussive, being able to bypass piercing or bludgeoning resistance and immunity, but not both. Disarm for being able to give you a little bit of benefits in disarming, but generally being worse than just having an open hand. Double barrel for paying exactly what it gives you as far as pure numbers goes, and simply being a utility piece for special ammunition. I do think I'm going to bump it up to B tier, particularly for the fact that doubling up on some magical ammunition can be very, very potent. Kickback for being a single extra point of damage and requiring some strength, incentivizing kind of a build that would go very well with Finesse and perhaps Thrown. Modular for being a more versatile but weaker version of the versatile trait. Razing for being decent at what it does but not coming up often enough to matter. Resonant for being very niche and paying for what it gives you in just a little bit too much cost. Training for being very, very niche and not playing into something that is particularly effective. Clockwork for being a worse version of Alchemical, more or less. I think that's good for C tier. At D tier, Capacity, because it has simply kind of been invalidated by the modern state of the game. Critical Fusion for kind of being misleadingly bad. It is pretending to be something on the same tier as Fatal, but is half the potency, well, less than half the potency, and being limited to a weaker variation. Hampering for being just far too weak and incapable of doing what it's trying to do. Nonlethal for, in most circumstances, being just a purely bad option, but still being relatively useful for roleplay. And set situations, I'm going to bump up to C tier. No, I'm going to keep it in D tier, because it's not that you want a non-lethal weapon, it's that you want something that'll let you make non-lethal attacks. Recovery for just being completely anti-synergistic with the concepts that you want to build, utilizing what it's offering. And repeating for utilizing only a very, very particular type of build. I think I'll bring it up to C tier, because it can also take advantage of things like poisoning all of the ammunition in a magazine and being able to shoot off poisons repeatedly without needing to spend actions reloading. I think that even though it pays so much in its base statistics, it's worth moving up to C. I think that's fine for D tier. And then down at F tier, we have Cobbled, where there's a 20% chance of just taking an extra action every time you fire it. Even though it's adding a lot to the power budget, that's more for fun than it is good at that point. It's far too inconsistent. Fatal Aim for trying, so hard to be an interesting thing, but being dragged down by the fact that it's balanced. And you would be much better off just using a fatal weapon and letting go of it when you need a free hand. And Injection for being a trait that you pay for that you're not really getting anything out of on the classes that want to use it, and not being useful for something that is even really good to begin with. I think that's fine for F tier. I'll do a very slow scroll here if you would like to look at it, but thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. This was a lot of effort to put together all of this. I had to collect a lot of my thoughts, and even though I didn't have everything perfect on me the whole way through, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this made you think of something. I hope it can help you come up with what you want to do going forward with your Pathfinder characters. Let me know in the comments down below what you would like to see in the future. I'm currently working on trying to do a combat demonstration utilizing some of the builds that I have put together in my class overview series. So look out for that one. And I will see you guys next time. See ya. See ya.